Hello, my name is Imad Harb, and I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I hope you are well and staying safe during these difficult times. The Saudi Arabian direct military involvement in Yemen entered its sixth year last March. As many of you who are following developments in Yemen know, things have not changed much since 2014 when the Houthi insurgents took over Sana'a and replaced legitimate President Abdullah Mansour Hadi. He now lives in exile in Saudi Arabia, while his government really fights for control of the south of the country and the city of Aden with the southern secessionists. Saudi Arabia has led an Arab military campaign in Yemen since March of 2015 to help restore Hadi's government. But the war has stalled and so far has actually failed to roll back the Houthis' insurgency. Saudi Arabia is also trying to mediate a very serious conflict between Hadi's government and the Southern Transitional Council that is supported by the United Arab Emirates and calls for secession of the South. Indeed, 2 months ago, declared self-rule in that area. This move is opposed by Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia today is going through some difficult times due to lower oil prices and the coronavirus pandemic. These economic difficulties are bound to influence Saudi Arabian foreign policy, specifically in neighboring Yemen. With us today to discuss the Saudi involvement and choices in Yemen is Dr. Christian Koos Ulrichsen, who is a non-resident senior fellow with Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Baker Institute fellow for the Middle East at Rice University. His research focuses on rule of law and due process in Middle Eastern and Arab Gulf states, issues of internal security and stability, and contemporary and early 20th century Middle Eastern history. Dr. Christian joins us today from the United Kingdom. Hello, Dr. Christensen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen is old and complicated. Could you just please give us a quick tour, so to speak, of Saudi involvement in Yemen since 2011, basically since Yemen's version of the Arab Spring?
Saudi Arabia has for decades seen Yemen as part of its strategic area of influence. And for decades, that influence was managed from the Saudi side by the Minister of Defense and the Crown Prince, Sultan, who was Crown Prince from 1995 until his death in 2011. And he had really managed the Yemen file for decades, for 40 or 50 years. He had personal relationships with all the key actors, the tribal sheikhs, government officials in Yemen. And he was able to really ensure that Saudi interests in Yemen were balanced across different groups. And from a Yemeni perspective, there were also individuals in Yemen, which had been split until 1990 between North and South, who also managed relationships in the same way. And they all began to falter in the late 2000s. Crown Prince Sultan fell ill and was absent from the scene for several years before he passed away in 2011. In Yemen, Abdullah Al-Akbar, a tribal leader, also died in 2007. With him also died a way of managing relationships. And of course, in 2011, the Arab Spring protests led to the huge escalation in demonstrations against Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president of Yemen since 1978, who also was ousted in early 2012. So within the space of those 4 or 5 years before 2011, the figures who had managed among them to sort of keep an elite bargain, an elite relationship, all fell from the scene. And that made things a lot more complicated once you had the Arab Spring and the transition in Yemen to a new leadership. And the way the Gulf states tried to transition was to have an elite leadership transition from Ali Abdullah Saleh to his vice president, Abdurabu Mansour Hadi. cutting out the streets, cutting out the people in the demonstrations who had made that transition potentially possible. So the Saudis, after 2011, lost a degree of leverage. The transition did not go so well. There was a national dialogue in 2012-13, which didn't resolve some of the issues. And of course, the fact that Ali Abdullah Saleh, although he was ousted as president, was allowed to remain in Yemen. He was the only leader who lost power as a result of the Arab Spring, who was allowed to stay in country with the exception of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, who at least was in prison for some of that time. Ali Abdullah Saleh, as the price of stepping down, was still in country, still the leader of the largest political organization in Yemen, the GPC, and was able to try and manipulate and to cause division among the successor government to him. And so in 2014, he aligned himself with the Houthi rebels, whom he had been fighting as president since 2004. The Yemeni government had engaged in on-off conflicts with the Houthis from 2004 until 2010. But then in 2014, Ali Abdullah Saleh, to try and regain influence, aligned with the Houthis along the Saudi-Yemeni border. They swept down to capture Sana'a, the capital, in September 2014, posing a threat to Saudi Arabia because the Houthi stronghold is on the Saudi-Yemeni border. And then in early 2015, they also threatened to capture the entire country of Yemen, including Aden, where the Yemeni government had decamped following the loss of Sana'a. And actually the day that Salman became king was the day that the Houthis really began to move towards Aden. So from the very first moment of Salman being king of Saudi Arabia and of his young son, Mohammed bin Salman, becoming Minister of Defense, from literally their very first day, they had to face and focus on a challenge that the Houthis, together with Ali Abdullah Saleh, were now potentially in state control on their southern border and were really presenting the Saudis with a very different Yemen from the one the Saudis had tried to manage and live with for so many years.
Just a little detail here. When Saleh remained in country, and he actually remained basically for a long period of time head of his party. Were the Saudis able to make inroads into that party, or were they just simply too lax to let him do whatever he wanted to do?
And I think the general fracturing of politics after 2011, also of Ali Abdullah Saleh's coalition, meant that the people around Saleh, who never really forgave the fact that he had been ousted, and ousted as a result of a Gulf Cooperation Council-led transition plan in which the Saudis were heavily involved. And the Saudis backed Hadi's government, not Ali Abdullah Saleh. So there was no real engagement, I think, between Ali Abdullah Saleh, the people around him, and the Saudis. And perhaps the Saudis and the other Gulf states, to a degree, underestimated Ali Abdullah Saleh's ability to be a spoiler. Certainly, I don't think people would have predicted that he would then align with the Houthis, a group he had fought with such force for so long when he was in power.
It really was such a move. It's amazing. I mean, just total 180-degree move to align himself with the Houthis. In your estimation, why did Saudi Arabia get militarily involved? I mean, they could have just kept supporting the Hadi government. They could have kept supporting tribal leaders, tribal forces against the Houthis. Why did they specifically get involved and organize this military coalition in March of 2015? And was it Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's idea originally? And I mean, how did they get into that? Talk to us about the thinking on that.
Well, for a start, when Mohammed bin Salman launched the war in Yemen in March 2015, he wasn't even Deputy Crown Prince. He was— That's correct, yeah. Only the Minister of Defense. He became Deputy Crown Prince a month later. Right. And then, of course, in 2017, became the Crown Prince. And at this point in March 2015, he was still a 29-year-old, largely unknown outside Saudi Arabia. who was trying to continue on his path of accumulating authority and eventually accumulating great power. And it seems as if, well, partially he had this very strong relationship with Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, almost like a mentor-mentee relationship. And it will have been, to some extent, Mohammed bin Zayed egging him on, saying, this is your chance to make a big statement. You know, you can become a hero in a sense.
Right.
But it does seem the Saudis went to war giving the Emiratis as well as the US only a couple of days' notice, even if that.
Right.
Mohammed bin Salman may have seen the chance to imprint himself on the national scene with a quick, decisive military victory, as he saw it happening at the time. B, also potentially falling prey to the illusion that Iran was outplaying Saudi Arabia, the UAE, in this post-Arab Spring environment when the Saudis and Emiratis were very quick to blame Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood, external actors, for domestic unrest or for regional unrest. And so maybe thinking Iran posed a greater threat on the Arabian Peninsula than it was seen to do. And the way to do that was to counter. And there was certainly an interesting timing because the war began the very week that P5+1 negotiators were meeting in Geneva with Iranian negotiators in the final week of negotiations to lead to the Iran nuclear deal. They signed an interim agreement that postponed the final agreement to July 2015, but the critical week of meetings was at the end of March. In fact, they began the day the Saudis went to war. And in my mind, there's a linkage between the two. It's not just a coincidence of timing. The Saudis and the Emiratis especially had always felt cut out of the JCPOA negotiation, the P5+1. They felt the US was negotiating in secret first, and then with the international community above their heads, with the country they felt was their biggest regional adversary.
Right.
And from a point of view of Riyadh, perhaps, this was a very strong statement that we, the Saudis, don't feel that you can separate Iran's nuclear deal from Iran's regionally destabilizing activity. So if you're not going to take action, we will. And it was almost perhaps daring the US to defy them by not supporting them. That they, the Saudis and the Emiratis, would actually act to protect their own regional interests if they felt the Obama administration and the international community was not prepared to do so. And to effectively dare them to back us or back the Iranians. So to my mind, there's part of that there. There was also the fact that the press conference to announce the war beginning was held in Washington, D.C. with the Saudi ambassador, Al Jubair, who then became foreign minister a month later. Clearly hosting a press conference announcing the beginning of the war in Washington sent a very clear message as to whom this message was aimed at.
That's correct, that's right.
United States. So I think all of those issues came together in March 2015. The Saudis thinking, or Mohammed bin Salman thinking, he could get a decisive, quick victory to stamp his control, his authority, and also making it very clear to the US that, fine, if you won't take action to counter Iran, we will. And that was really the beginning of, in my view, the war beginning the way it did.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask you about basically the reputation. Saudi Arabia's reputation has really suffered a lot from the humanitarian conditions that are going on in Yemen today, the destruction of health facilities and education facilities, and a lot of people and diseases and lack of food and all that. But it comes at a time when really Saudi Arabia is really very upset with what's happening in southern Yemen and the Emirati role there. Explain to us what appears to be really, they appear to be really working at cross purposes in southern Yemen, and the Saudis are not happy with the Southern Transitional Council, what it's doing in southern Yemen. How is that playing out, and how will that generally affect Saudi-Emirati relations in the future?
Part of the problem is that the Saudi-led coalition is really a coalition of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, at least until 2019, when
Right.
the UAE withdrew most of its support. And over time, what happened, you had a de facto division of spheres of influence, almost mirroring the old North-South Yemen split before 1990, where the Saudis were heavily focused on Yemen in terms of North Yemen, in terms of the Houthi threat, and engaged in supporting groups in North Yemen. And the Emiratis were engaged in, after retaking Aden and Mukalla in 2015, with quite a successful military operation. After that, the UAE was engaged in kind of carving out a sphere of influence. It was part of a broader geopolitical objective of carving out UAE influence across the Horn of Africa region.
Correct.
So you have very different spheres of influence that gradually solidified. And the UAE and Saudi also worked with different groups politically, different elements on the ground. They also had different perceptions of the threat. So the Saudis have a direct border threat from the Houthis, whereas the UAE saw this as part of the region-wide pushback against Islamists in general and part of its geopolitical ambition to secure influence in the region. So they were never working together necessarily on the ground. Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed might work together closely as individuals. But the problem then would be that decisions taken by them too would then be channeled through different chains of command. And so by the time you got to the people on the ground, 5 or 6 steps removed, they were very different. And as long as the war continued, there was less chance of a political clash. But over the past year, as we've seen a de-escalation in tension in some parts of Yemen and also in terms of Iranian issues as well, as we've now begun to move towards some sort of political resolution eventually, that's when it becomes harder to kick the can down the road. And some of those contradictions become more obvious and less easy to manage. And so the clashes in 2019 between the Southern Transitional Council, backed by the UAE, and groups in the Yemeni government in Aden, backed by Saudi Arabia, was, I think, a foretaste of what we may now see more of. And of course, the Southern Transitional Council's declaration of self-rule in April has been fiercely resisted by the Saudis and by the Yemeni government in exile. And in part, it reflects a breakdown of the Riyadh agreement, the power-sharing agreement between the STC and the Yemeni government that was supposed to have been agreed in Riyadh last November.
That's correct. Yeah.
It has led to differing interpretations as to what was agreed and to who needs to make the first move. The devil is in the detail and in terms of who moves first. And so once again, we've seen a complication where you have an agreement, but then you have differing interpretations of it. And that, of course, is separate from the Stockholm Agreement of 2018 between the Yemeni government and the Houthis, and of course, different from other splits in Yemen too. So the problem with Yemen today is you have 3 or 4 different sets of splits that don't follow a clean and clear breakdown. And so you have these cross purposes emerging, which will make it much harder to come to some sort of resolution to bring the war to an end.
Right. And all of this is affecting Saudi Arabia and affecting its reputation. Saudi involvement in Yemen has really had serious repercussions here in Washington, and especially in Congress. What is how do you look at what is going to be happening regarding the U.S. Position towards Saudi Arabia, whether it's in Yemen? How is that influencing general U.S.-Saudi relations?
Well, before everyone talks, I mean, people do talk about the current administration, the Trump administration, being very close to Saudi. Although we must also acknowledge that U.S. support for the war in Yemen began under President Obama. And for all Obama administration officials now saying we wish we hadn't done it, the fact is that they did. And so this has been a bipartisan, kind of 2 successive administrations, at the very least, not intervening forcefully enough to bring an end to the war, either by denying military assistance to Saudi Arabia making it impossible for them to continue prosecuting it, or from really putting direct pressure on the Saudis. So this has been an issue now for two very different presidential administrations.
Right.
Having said that, the Saudis are now under great political pressure in Washington, partly because of Yemen, but also because of the fallout from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2014. And now, more recently, also from oil prices, which has really angered Republicans in Congress as well. So the Saudi-US relationship has really become politicized in a way it never was. It's become more vulnerable to pressure politically. And arguably, from a Saudi point of view, the Trump administration has been shielding the Saudi and shielding Mohammed bin Salman over the past 2 years from some of his most fierce critics in Congress.
Right.
The question becomes, what happens in November if a Democrat is elected? Now, there again, the fact that the Democrat nominee, and therefore the Democrat president, if there is one, will be Joe Biden, who was the vice president, of course, when they supported the Saudis in the beginning of the war.
That's correct, yes.
Less scope for potential rupture than there would have been, say, under Joe Biden or under Bernie Sanders or some of the others who were vying for the candidacy. So there'll be more continuation, I think. But at the same time, I think there will be greater pressure on the Saudis from Congress that the next White House, if it's a different White House, might be less inclined to try and block. And so that political pressure will really bring the Saudis maybe to bear to actually bring this war to an end, or at least to support, not to block any attempts to find a negotiated solution that involves all parties in Yemen, foes as well as friends.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have today, but thank you very much for really helping us understand the Saudi involvement in Yemen. Thank you, Dr. Christian, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you. Hope so.
Thank you. Goodbye from me. Please continue your engagement with Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Likewise. Hope to see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.